All right, Manuel, the recording has started. Go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Steve. So I'm Manuel Garriga. I'm a cloud solution architect on the US EDU team. I know probably several of you on the call. Today, Rich McBrine and I will be kind of leading this conversation, but we've got a lot of our colleagues that are also subject matter experts in this area that are on the call as well. Please, as Steve said, feel free to drop questions into the IM window, and we will try to tamp those down as we go through. And of course, at the end, we'll do the open Q&A, open mic stuff. Rich, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Rich McBrine. I'm a cloud architect, same as Manuel. We're peers on the same EDU team. We've worked with numerous EDU clients with these technologies, and we bring a wealth of experience between the two of us, and you know, all of our other colleagues on the. Interested to hear your challenges as we go through this, and you know, Manuel, back to you. Let's get kicked off.
Excellent. So, you know, VDI has been a very busy spot for us in EDU, and it got crazy when COVID hit, right? You know, we lit up at the beginning, I think it was the third week of March, we lit up 8 hours a week of just open office hours for folks to just come on and get stuff set up, right? Because, you know, all your staff and students are suddenly remote. Everything's upside down, don't have enough VPN concentrator capacity. You don't have VMware Horizon or Citrix desktop, Zen desktop, you know, capacity to put everybody on all of a sudden. So we had a lot of customers rushing to the cloud, right? And the good thing is, you know, I think we were pretty well prepared because we were fans of these VDI solutions before COVID hit. And the reason why we're having this session is because we added another native first-party VDI solution called Windows 365 to the mix at the end of July. Satya Nadella announced that, and that caused, you know, a lot of interest, right, in a lot of EDU customers because there's a ton of marketing around Windows 365. And so we put the session together because we figured, you know, you all may want some help disambiguating, like, man, there's now three native first-party options to do VDI in Azure, and maybe I didn't even hear about this Azure Lab Services thing. So that's why we're here today. We're going to walk through some of the learnings we've had around best use case for each of these and where they fit. So hopefully you'll leave this session understanding a little better what the options are. This material is actually customer facing in the Azure Hour community, and we've got a lot of our colleagues that have helped contribute to the content here. So just want to give props where props are due. This is a collaborative effort, and certainly we've had a lot of feedback from customers that went into this material. And so some timely points, given where we are right now with the recent release of another third option, we want to cover some of the high points, right? So, you know, Windows 365 is a new kid on the block. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. And then Eric Orman from the Windows 365 PG has actually got the session after us, and he's going to dive real deep into this, right? So think of this as the intro to all three options, and then we'll dive real deep into Windows 365 in the next session. But the key about Windows 365 that you can take away is, hey, it delivers a one-to-one cloud PC with a fixed price. It's got a lower complexity to deliver versus something like Azure Virtual Desktop, and it complements but does not replace Azure Lab Services and Azure Virtual Desktop. So again, it's a third option. It doesn't replace either of the two that already existed. And in our experience, most of our EDU customers are actually opting for a mix of these VDI solutions based on their goals for each scenario, not necessarily a technology. So, like, you know, it's kind of one of those things, you know, like I came from a higher ed. I spent, you know, 20 years at a research high ed with a medical campus. And, you know, a lot of times it's, hey, let's pick which of these solutions we're going to use, and we're going to go with that. And really what's interesting about the offerings here is that you can kind of look at the project and challenge you have in front of you for this departmental customer, for that faculty member, and decide, hey, this is the solution I'd like to use. None of them is an extreme heavy lift. They're all a lot easier to do than VDI ever was to do on premises. And so they each all have their merits, and it's certainly not an all eggs in one basket scenario. Rich, is there anything you wanted to comment on that?
No, I think please continue.
Perfect. And then, you know, getting a little bit deeper into this, you know, let's talk about some of the sweet spots for each one of these services, because I just rattled off 3 different service names, and to you it may mean nothing, right? So let's talk about what they mean. I'm going to start with the think about from, you know, let's say lower IT involvement, central IT involvement, to heavier. So from left to right, we're going from very light IT involvement to a little bit heavier IT involvement all the way to the right with Azure Virtual Desktop. And I'll explain what this means. So, you know, we have this service that's Lab Services that was actually created for the EDU space. It's a first-party Azure service that a lot of people outside of EDU don't even know exists. In fact, I just worked on a on a Hack for Good project last week, where a lot of my colleagues at Microsoft and other verticals didn't even know this service existed, right? It's really tuned for EDU. What does it do? It provides Linux, and that's highlighted because it's the only solution here on the screen that does Linux and Windows client or Windows Server, persistent personal systems to end users, right? It's for one-to-one. That's what it does. It's a complete Microsoft end-to-end managed service. The virtual machines are intended to be unmanaged, right? So the idea here is you deploy this virtual machine, you give it to Rich, and Rich uses it typically for a semester, for a course, and any changes Rich makes to it, and Rich can be the admin of the OS, they stick, they stay. And then the other really important thing is, Rich's faculty member for his course can actually create the virtual machine image. So this is a good option for IT to get out of the way and say, hey, faculty member, for example, here's a base image of Ubuntu. Go ahead and salt in whatever you want into the template image and publish that out to the class. And you go ahead and use that the whole semester. And the students will be able to have their own VM. The faculty member can reset them. There's a quota that you can set, and there's schedules you can set. So it's got really powerful controls to help make sure that the consumption is constrained into what's needed. The students can turn on their own virtual machine and consume those outside of scheduled quota hours at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. If that's when they want to prep and cram, that's fine. If they run out of quota hours, they can't boot their VM, right? So it's got those kind of cool limiting factors. But the whole idea here is for IT to be able to get out of the way and let the faculty move, which is pretty cool. So that's a really good fit for those academic learning scenarios. It's also a really good fit for staff training scenarios in many cases. So it's really a powerful tool there, and we tend to drive a lot of customers that have academic facing scenarios towards lab services. The new kid on the block sits here in the middle is Windows 365 Enterprise, right? And so Windows 365 Enterprise also is a one-to-one offering. It offers Windows 10 or Windows 11 as persistent desktops for users. It is also an end-to-end managed Microsoft service. It has one-stop administration in Microsoft Endpoint Manager, MEM, and Intune, right? Is MEM and Intune is how you manage this the virtual machines. It is IT-led, but it's a lot less overhead, a lot less stuff to build than Azure Virtual Desktop, right? Very much simpler. And the powerful thing that this has is a flat rate per unit cost, just like your M365 licenses, right? So, if you were to buy M365 A5, you understand this is the cost for the SKUs, you assign it to the users, and that's how you get your value from that suite. Well, very similar to this, right? Windows 365, you purchase a SKU or, some number of SKUs that represent a T-shirt size, right? Virtual machine, you assign that to your users, and it feels just like licensing Microsoft 365 product, right? So it's a little different than either Lab Services or Azure Virtual Desktop in that manner, because both those other services have variable consumption based on use. This is fixed cost, and that virtual machine is on all the time. It's important to note that is on all the time. It's interesting because the other options, typically are stop the virtual machine to stop cost, right? And so Windows 365 is a little bit unique in that sense that, hey, the machine's always on, that Excel spreadsheet is open to the spot the user left it at. And it may make a lot of sense for full-time kind of faculty-facing scenarios. We find it makes a lot of sense. And then Azure Virtual Desktop has been around for a while, right? It's not the new kid on the block, but it does, it offers Windows 10, Windows 11, one-to-one persistent as well as one-to-many. So it can do one-to-one. Rich gets a machine, Steve gets a machine. It can also do, I've got a virtual machine that 20 people use, right? And that virtual machine can be running Windows 10. It can do multi-session desktops for both Windows 10 client and Windows 11 client and Windows Server. It can also do Windows 7 if you needed to do that for some reason in a one-to-one mode. And it can also do remote app publishing. So if all you want to do is publish out, for example, a good example we saw at the beginning of COVID is, I just want to publish out the remote desktop client. So then end users sitting at home can securely relay to their research workstation on campus when they're suddenly at home. Yeah, sure. You can just publish out the MSTSC client if you want, right? Or you could publish out the line of business app that the employee needs. You guys as customers actually manage all the infrastructure components, right? So when you think about the virtual machines, there are virtual machines in your subscription that you can set Azure policy against and manage them. You have full control over the configuration and things like the network egress path, et cetera. It's all under your control because they're your VMs. And it's typically an IT-led deployment for sure on this one. Typically, we have our customers' domain joining the session hosts, right? You have all the goodness of Active Directory. Also, there is a Citrix and VMware offering related to Azure Virtual Desktop that takes advantage of the wonderful licensing we have here. Key to that is, of course, if you own M365 A3 or A5, you own the licensing you need to deliver a Windows 10 or Windows 11 one-to-one or one-to-many desktop to all those users, staff and students. And the same holds true for those of you that want to do Citrix in Azure or VMware in Azure. We have that offering around the licensing as well. And of course, it has flexible consumption-based pricing. So here, you set up a scenario where you're paying for what you use. When those virtual machines are on and running, you're paying for them. The disks associated with the VMs, you're paying for them. But when they're stopped and deallocated, you're not paying for that compute. So that cost curve follows the usage curve, right? So it's a different option. Rich, I kind of beat this one to death. Is there anything you want to add to that?
A couple of things. There's some comments in chat that I think bear, talking about for the entire group. AVD on the far right obviously has way more options, right? And it's come out in chat through several, notes in there. It's also way more complex, to be blunt. And it's a typical thing. You don't get more capability / options without driving up complexity. The point has been raised that Win365, in the middle, way easier in many ways to deploy. And when we talk about staffing to meet demand, I mean, Manuel and I have lived this, as have others on this call. AVD is a full-time job for full-time administrators. Win365, I would say, is less because there are fewer moving parts, but there's also fewer options, right? Lab Services is interesting because of all of them. I think it's the lowest cost. But at the end of the day, it's meant for a specific set of use cases. Obviously, it's different from the other ones. It's not up and running all the time like Win365. It doesn't offer a remote app like AVD does. It's only one-to-one. AVD does one-to-many. And I'll end on this. When we were looking at this slide, this is the second point. When we were looking at this slide, Manuel and I went through and highlighted the biggest differences in bold that really differentiate these products. Because the more we've been talking about this, the more I say, as soon as a client says Linux Lab Services, only way to do it with our VDI solutions. Only is a strong word. You shouldn't say that, but bottom line, I always think that. When I'm in the middle and a client says to me, I want predictable costs. Well, that's Win365. Flat rate per unit cost. That's the first thing I think about, right? And it's not I'm going to skim through it quickly, Manuel. When I think AVD on the right, that's scale. That is scale. I want 10,000 remote users on their Macintosh to get one specific app that only runs on Windows. That's a remote app on AVD. And then when you talk about integration with third-party products like Citrix and VMware, which isn't to say they'll never touch these other things, but that's plug and AVD, which again drives complexity. And again, just calling out some things I saw in chat, Manuel. Back to you.
Perfect. And I did have a little bit of a device snafu there, so hopefully you can still see the presentation deck.
Yeah, I'm looking at the quick overview slide. Yep.
All right, perfect. So one of the things we realize, and as customers are probably going to be adopting more than one of these technologies, is it might be helpful to provide a decision kind of flowchart tree. And so very early on in August, we put this together as a team because we were realizing, man, this, helping navigate which destination to get to. As a child of the 80s, growing up in the 80s, reading my Choose Your Own Adventure books, I'm kind of drawn to this kind of a thing. And so, we think about this, for you all, this could be a useful tool. And we've gotten positive feedback from customers around this chart, right? Saying, look, you guys are mostly probably in IT and you've got internal customers coming to you with needs. Well, here's a good sifter for you, right? To figure out, hey, do the VDI VMs need to run Linux? Well, then we're over in AZ Labs, very easy answer, right? Things like, do I require a GPU, GPU for, let's say, visualization, right? Well, if I require a GPU today, Windows 365 doesn't have that, right? So you're going to move away from Windows 365. Are you using Intune and MEM, or are you willing to adopt it, right? If you're not, then probably Windows 365 is not the best fit for you, even for a staff one-to-one scenario, right? So we tried to capture, and this has been iterated quite a bit. It seems to be holding up well, testing over time. This, again, is valid as of today. Eric will probably talk about stuff that the Windows 365 team is building. This will change over time, right? So there will be things that change over, it's cloud, right? So services will adopt new features, and that will change some of this criteria. We will update this. And so just know that, this will be a takeaway for you all to help you, and then to always check back in the Azure Hour community to see if there are new versions of this, because we keep this in front of customers at all times as we iterate it. One of the things that can help you feed into that decision tree is asking the right questions. And so we're providing you all a primer that we actually provided our colleagues on the Microsoft EDU team, right, to help have that conversation with their customers, just like you are having the conversation with your customers, right? And so this helps with some of those prompt questions, right? Do you require a GPU? That's an important decision matrix, right? Decision choice, right? Are you trying to publish a full desktop or just an application, right? That'll drive decision making. Is this semester driven, or is this going to be year-round use? If it's semester driven, maybe that's something we look at Azure Lab Services for, right? Because the life cycle of the lab can be cleaned up and deleted at the end of the semester, right? These other solutions are really not so much intended for the semester use case, right? And then, what are the regulatory requirements you have to meet? Some of our solutions here, are still attaining some of the regulatory requirements, right? So like Windows 365, may not have HIPAA high-tech at the moment, right? It's being worked on. There's not a reason why it won't meet that, but at the moment, it doesn't have that. It's just got released. And so these are some of the things that can drive decisions in one direction or the other. So we're trying to prompt with some of those questions to hopefully help you all disambiguate when you're working with your own internal customers. And so,
yeah, Manuel, to tack onto that, I'm sorry, I got one thing to tack onto that. Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to add was, we get asked a lot at Microsoft, hey, you're in education, what's the right use case? Tell me all the use cases for AVD. Tell me all the use cases for Win365, and tell me all the use cases for lab services. And our answer always is, no, that's not the right way to look at it. It's not a technology, you're looking for a solution. Let's reverse that and start with, what do you need? And then consequently, going back to the chart that was on earlier, based on your answers, we'll figure out the right solution. And I'll give you a great for instance. For instance, when somebody says to me, Win365, when should I use it? I say, well, it's for 24/7 access year round. So most of the time that's going to be staff. And then immediately a client will say back, well, I've got grad students that are, TAs that are year round. And I'm like, well, that's also a good use case for them. And it proves out the point that you've got to come back to the use case every time. We're not a hammer looking for a nail. It's really, you've got to ask the right questions internally to the client's thing, just like we do when any one of our clients comes to us. So back to you, Manuel. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, good call out, Rich. This is another kind of similar version of this with the kind of answers that help you drive that directionality. This would be something you'd have in your back pocket, not so much to put in front of your own, customers, internal customers. But this helps make some of those easy decisions, left or right, right? We know the answer to this. Okay, moving left or right. And then let's drill into a little bit of these solutions, right? I covered them at a kind of a high level. Let's drill in just a little bit deeper, because I know we got a lot of technical folks on the call. And so let's talk a little bit about how they work. So, here is a great kind of visual explaining what Lab Services looks like and does, right? And so, Lab Services, there's an Azure Resource Manager ARM, resource that is a lab account. And inside the lab account, there are multiple labs, and each lab has got virtual machines. And this is kind of interesting and different. If you've ever done virtual machines in Azure, right, you're typically used to seeing the virtual machine, right? It's your VM. Well, in Azure Lab Services, those VMs are actually running in a Microsoft managed subscription. You don't see those VMs in your subscription. It's part of what allows this to have a unique feature, which is this solution, despite the fact that each of these VMs has a disk and that disk is persistent, this solution has zero cost when the VM is powered off. So let me let that sink in for a second. You can have up to 300 VMs in a lab for a class, right? Think of the big classes. You can have 300 VMs for 300 students. And when you turn off those VMs, even though the data persists, there is zero cost until you turn the VM back on. That is very unique in the world of cloud VDI. I don't think any other vendor has something like that. Now, there's a give-get on that, right? Because of the fact that we're essentially eating the cost of this storage, we're keeping these VMs behind a curtain, right? They're running in a Microsoft managed subscription. They're deployed for you. The interaction with this is through a very simple portal. It's really cool because it's not the Azure portal. The whole point of this is that Staples Easy button, right? The faculty member and the end student user do not interact with portal.azure.com. They interact with labs.azure.com, which is only for Azure Lab Services, and it's super simple UX, right? And so we think about this whole thing. This is that easy button where IT goes, hey, faculty, we would like you to have some ownership over the experience. We can help you out. We can do things like have a shared image gallery where IT might pre-publish curated images for, Ubuntu and Windows 10, and then, maybe a Windows Server with SQL Server on it. And you faculty members just go ahead and deploy at the beginning of your semester, deploy a lab. The other thing that's really cool is because this is education focused, this also has integrations with things like Teams, SDS, and a couple of the student information system vendors. We're starting to get plumbing to be able to have essentially the labs auto rostered. That means even VMs auto created. And again, the creation part of the VM doesn't cost you anything. It's the running part of the VM where the student's using it. So it's really cool because you can plumb in Azure Lab Services and say, okay, CIS 120 section AF, I've got a security group or a SDS feed or an SIS feed that represents who are the students in that class and who the teacher is. And bam, this is just auto doing it for me. It's having that VDI lab ready for me. It cooks it up for me. If a student gets added to the class, it adds a VM, right, on the next sync. And in some cases, that's the next 24 hours. But it's really unique, right? So we think about this as super EDU tuned, right? We got a lot of scenarios that are used for hackathons. There's a lot of different in the documentation for Azure Lab Services. A lot of different really cool scenarios too around things like data science VMs, red team, blue team hacking. It also supports GPU in case there was a need for GPU visualization, and it supports nested virtualization. So again, we said this is Rich gets his own machine and Ken gets his own machine. But what happens if Rich needs a client and a server? Well, you can deploy a Hyper-V host for Rich that has 2 VMs already on it, and then Rich has a client and a server. And by the way, they're on his little private network, so they can attack and defend each other, do whatever he wants to do. So it's really kind of neat. So again, I've kind of waxed poetic about this, but I think a lot of folks don't know about this service, so that's why we talk about it quite a bit. One of the things to call out, though, is because this runs behind a curtain, you don't get to control things like next hop for the NICs, the virtual network interfaces on these VMs, right? This is running on a Microsoft managed subscription, so you don't get to do something like put an egress firewall here. You'd have to do whatever you want to do for any kind of compliance. And again, in the K-12 space, not important to this call, but in the K-12 space, they have egress compliance requirements around SIPA. This is a challenge that has to be met with agents within the VM. Again, high ed on this call, so not such a concern. Anything else, teammates, that I should add to the lab services part? I think we kind of got all that stuff. One of the things that's interesting is go ahead. Rich?
No, I just said that you got it. You nailed it. We're good.
All right, cool. The other thing that's kind of interesting I didn't mention is that there's some pretty extreme flexibility on user identity here. With Azure Lab Services, of course, you can use an Azure AD account to authenticate the student or the teacher to the lab. The operating system identity, though, as I mentioned earlier, if you'll remember, I said these are intended to be unmanaged virtual machines. So the OS identity that you'll use for Windows or Linux typically is baked into the OS image, right? It's not like the VM is going to be domain joined. Yes, there are docs showing how you can pull that off, but that's not really the intent of this service, right? They're supposed to be unmanaged VMs. Now, one thing that's interesting, though, is, as I mentioned, the identity that the user uses to walk up to the portal and go get their machine and turn on their machine and get the RDP or SSH link to connect to their machine, that identity can be even a consumer identity, which is pretty cool, right? So if you have scenarios where you have high school students that are applicants to the university that are not quite on the identity train yet, or you have scenarios where you've got external entities like vendors that you don't want to deal with an identity for, you can do some interesting things around training those folks, et cetera, with external identities. So yes, you can use Azure AD, but you can also use consumer accounts. You can also just say, hey, possession of this link means you get a VM, full stop. So it kind of fits a bunch of different usage modalities. More flexible than some of the other options. Now let's talk about Windows 365 Enterprise. Again, Eric is going to dive into this deeper in the next session, but this is a little bit of a technical diagram of what it looks like. Notice that you have Microsoft services and the virtual machines are over here. kind of similar to Azure Lab Services, the virtual machines do not exist in your Azure subscription. These virtual machines exist in an environment that, in Azure that Microsoft is managing. But what's different about this service versus AZ Labs is that each of these virtual machines, the Windows 365 cloud PCs, each one of them has got a virtual NIC that is connected to, essentially injected into your virtual network in Azure. And again, we're discussing Windows 365 Enterprise. There are 2 SKUs of Windows 365. I'm going to leave it to Eric to go disambiguate that. We'll help you, Eric. But there's Business SKU and Enterprise SKU. Clearly, all of you are enterprise customers. Windows 365 Enterprise is what you need to be using. Today, Windows 365 Enterprise injects a VNIC into your Azure virtual network. You need line of sight to Active Directory to domain join or hybrid domain join those Windows 365 machines. Again, that's all done automatically for you as long as line of sight exists. It's all done automatically for you. The PG has actually done a really good job of creating these green-red health checks to make sure that all of that is not only in place when you deploy, but in place over time, which is very, very cool, right? And the cool thing is then you've got a cloud PC that feels like it's, a corporate managed machine. It's on all the time and it's sitting in the cloud waiting for you to use anytime. You don't have to manage any of these layers here, the connection broker, web access, et cetera. That's all managed by Microsoft and part of the value you're getting out of that Windows 365 license. The client endpoints all connect over HTTPS. And there are clients for all the different, platforms out there, right? Windows, obviously, Mac OS, iOS, HTML5 client that you can use from any platform. And those clients all connect over HTTPS. They do not connect over TCP 3389 RDP. They do not require any kind of VPN access. Your end users just need HTTPS outbound, right? And that's a big deal, right? I've been at airports. I don't know about you guys. I've been back before COVID. I've been at airports where the airport Wi-Fi doesn't let you egress over 3389 because it's too dangerous. They don't want to let that port egress out. But every public network lets you access egress HTTPS, right? And of course, that's all that we need for this client to work. So when you think about how you're going to empower those typically staff members to have the access to that cloud PC, all they need is internets, and that's all they need. Again, fixed cost. And this one, because of the VNIC ejection, it does support your ability to, within that virtual network, control next hop. So if you want to run all the egress packets through a Palo Alto firewall or through Azure firewall or Juniper or Cisco, what have you, however you roll, you can absolutely do that. And that's a differentiator between Azure Lab Services and this Windows 365 option, right? Azure Virtual Desktop also supports that. But it's the key here is, though, even though the VMs are not in your managed environment, the VNICs are, and therefore you can influence the egress path for that as well. And of course, that also means that they potentially, if you allow it, have access over the private network to your corporate resources, right? Your campus resources. And so that's very powerful. If they need to access, a database server on premises, as long as you're not blocking the private IP network that you've put on that virtual network, you've got that express route circuit, you've got the VPN tunnel. These Windows 365 cloud PCs that you've given to your staff can access those resources on campus. So very powerful, a very powerful option. And the cool thing here, of course, is IT is not having to set up a lot of stuff. All IT has to have is a virtual network in Azure that has line of sight to domain controllers to make this go. There are a bunch of different SKUs that are available, right? So you think about T-shirt sizes. It's not, the 180 different SKUs that there are for Azure VMs, right? But there are quite a few different T-shirt sizes available, up to fairly large ones. Obviously, price goes up as T-shirt size specs go up. You'll notice there are not GPUs on this list yet, but I know Eric and the team are working on that, getting GPUs into this story. And, there's published pricing on this, right? You guys can transact this today. And then there's, some of the highlights just to review, Windows 10 and Windows 11, now that Windows 11 is GA'd. Hybrid Azure AD join is how we do things. The users are hybrid users. Eric will talk to futures around, evolution there. But today just need a VNet in Azure that has line of sight to domain controllers and you're good to go. And you can start rolling. And the cool thing is you can let your desktop admins that are used to managing in Intune and MEM, you can have them manage this environment. A little different than typically we see with Azure Virtual Desktop, right? Azure Virtual Desktop, usually it's the Azure folks that are adminning that. And then we've got some FAQs here. I'll leave this. This will be more of a leave behind for you all. One of the things I will call out is, of course, there's not an FS Logics. So when you think about the user data, it sits inside the cloud PC, and it is persistent. But that also means you don't have to manage data around a user profile, right? It's in the VM. And so I'm sure Eric will expand a little bit more on some of the future plans around that data, et cetera. Got a lot of different resources we have, including this Windows 365 interactive demo is powerful because it gives you a feel for the deployment steps for Windows 365 Enterprise, and that answers a lot of the questions you may have, right? If you haven't touched it before, just the click-through demo can be powerful. And the other thing is, I don't want to steal too much of Eric's thunder, but the trials are open again. So if you wanted to trial this out, you can actually ask for a trial in your M365 console and get a trial SKU for a month of Windows 365, so you can play with it. I've been yapping fast and a lot. Eric, I put a bunch of stuff in your queue, Eric. Sorry. Are there any questions or any other things that we should get to before we start talking about Azure Virtual Desktop? I think the team has been, looks like I'm looking at the chat here. Looks like we've been knocking those down pretty good. So for Azure Virtual Desktop, just to expand on that, here's kind of a visual of what the infrastructure looks like. Forgive me, this is actually baked into it. It used to be called Windows Virtual Desktop, so forgive the wrong nomenclature there. It's actually Azure Virtual Desktop today. But here in the Azure subscription, which is your customer subscription, you're going to have the desktops, the virtual machines, their NICs, et cetera. You'll have the images and apps, et cetera, and your FS Logics profile storage for the user profiles. That all exists in your subscription, which means you pay for that stuff, right? So you pay for the VM when it's running, the disk attached to the VM, whether it's running or not, your FS Logics profile storage, right? You pay for that, however much data that is, right? And for smaller deployments, it's not a lot, but for big, huge deployments of tens of thousands of users, this adds up. And then, of course, you'll have a VPN or ExpressRoute cross-premises connectivity because typically you want to get to line of business apps, et cetera. And most customers are deploying domain joined or hybrid Azure AD domain joined session hosts. The product recently GA'd the capability to do pure Azure AD join. So you can pure Azure AD join your Azure Virtual Desktop session hosts, but there are some caveats and limitations, things like no FS Logics profiles, no MSIX app attach, et cetera. Since I mentioned MSIX app attach, I do want to say uniquely, this is the one support containerizing applications as MSIX packages. Our resident wizard on our team is Ken Hoover. And so on Thursdays, he's often talking about this on our VDI office hours. But containerizing the apps via MSIX app attach is really, really powerful because it simplifies your gold image and allows you to also reduce the amount of storage required for especially the universities that have got engineering apps that are very heavy. You don't need such a large disk that you pay for all month long attached to these session hosts because you've peeled that out into SMB storage and only have one copy of that app instead of 20 session hosts or 200 session hosts with that app. So there's some, again, we're getting into GrassBlade details, but you can see this is a more IT-centric solution with a lot more knobs, buttons, and sliders, which is, lets you optimize in many ways. The fact that it's one-to-many is a huge deal, right? So, we've got customers with, 30,000 staff using Azure Virtual Desktop. And the fact that you can do one-to-many is very important to the cost scenario, right? So if I can take and set up 128 gig of RAM, 32 core session host, and I can pile, 60 users into that, that's really, really powerful, right? That means that I don't need 60 individual virtual machines. So this is an interesting, use case for scale. That's why I think Rich teased at it earlier. If you're going for large scale, you're probably looking at multi-user and you're looking at Azure Virtual Desktop, right? There are some scenarios where you might be doing, mid to large size scale on one-to-one, and Windows 365 is still a very good option in that scenario. But as soon as you look to really push economies of scale, if you can go multi-user, definitely want to do it over here. This is where you get the most squeeze. And then the other one, to call out here is, again, the network is managed by you all, the customer, so you have complete control over the network and the virtual machines themselves. So when you think about all the cool stuff that you may see around Azure Policy, that you see around Azure Defender and Security Center on the Azure management plane side, because these desktops exist in your Azure management plane, you have all those features, right? With the other two solutions, those virtual machines do not exist in your subscription. So those are not part of what you do. It's not part of what you have to do. It's also not part of what you can do. From a green red compliance perspective, et cetera, I want a policy that says all disks shall be encrypted. Great, we do that anyway, right? In Azure for all these solutions, the disks are encrypted. But you being able to see that and have that as a policy is something you can do when the VM is yours, right? And this one does allow you to do that. Also, this carries attestations for things like HIPAA, high-tech, PCI, right? This is a service that carries those attestations. So some of you all that are doing secure research enclaves, Windows 365 might ostensibly be a good option, but until those attestations come through, it may not be an option you can exercise in production, right? And so this is one of the ones that carries a lot of those attestations. So sometimes when we're dealing with secure scenarios, compliance scenarios, we push the Azure Virtual Desktop option, the button, so to speak, because we can gain those compliance attestations. Also, this is offered in GovCloud as well for those that have to deploy research scenarios in GovCloud. All right, I think that's all I had. Rich, Ken, team, anything else we should add here?
I don't have anything, Manuel. Yep.
Okay, perfect. And then similar, just in the vein of having the review slide, this is, again, leave behind for you all. When you have those internal discussions, these are the highlights of the uniqueness of AVD. And then this is probably what you all are most interested in. That's great. You guys showed me different options. Show me the money. And so what we're doing here is ERP pricing, comparing Azure Virtual Desktop one-to-one with Windows 365 Enterprise. Again, because Azure Lab Services tends to be an academic scenario that's usually got quite different requirements and you filter over to there pretty quick. The one that seems to have the most overlap, right, typically in our discussions with the customers is, do I do Windows 365 or do I do Azure Virtual Desktop? And the one area where there's the most overlap is when you feel you need it to be a one-to-one. And so that's what we did in a cost comparison here. And so what we have here is the different columns are Windows 365 ERP, right, which is a fixed cost T-shirt size, right? And this is the SKU for Windows 365 that we used. And then in Azure, for Azure Virtual Desktop, we use the same geometry, right? 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM, 128 gig managed standard SSD. And that's what we did for the comparison. You can see here that Azure Virtual Desktop, even a 1-year reserved instance for that virtual machine is more pricey across the board for these 3 different T-shirt sizes. So when you think about having a scenario where you have always on, always available for a staff member in Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop, again, one-to-one, it's a little more pricey to do that in Azure Virtual Desktop. Certainly would be way more pricey pay-go, right? 730 hours a month. But even with the 1-year reservation, it's still cheaper to do Windows 365. Where you do get to a break point where you're talking about counting just a few dollars of difference is when you get to a 3-year reservation. But you have to ask yourself, do I want to manage the additional infrastructure that is around Azure Virtual Desktop, or would I prefer to just have the desktop team manage Intune and MEM profiles for Windows 365 for the $2 and some and change difference, right? And so this is a value proposition you guys have. And then the other one that comes into the mix to color it a little bit is, well, what if I only run the Azure Virtual Desktop 200 hours a month? And this is, depending on features like, schedule start and stop, or VM start on connect, which is new, relatively new to Azure Virtual Desktop, where the end user can walk in, the virtual machine that they have is not on, Rich's machine is not on. The service will start the VM for Rich. Now, the only thing is Rich has got to hold his coffee for a couple minutes while the virtual machine starts up, calls home, says I'm here, and then Rich can connect. Now, that's not the same experience as walking up to Eric's Windows 365 and just logging in, because that thing's on all the time, right? And so there's give and get here. But the point is, we wanted to compare some of the scenarios that our customers are, especially on those Thursday calls, right? Our customers are launching really interesting scenarios at us, and we're kind of working them out, doing the pricing calculator. And so, from those learnings, we kind of put at least 3 of those comparative scenarios. Again, 1 year, whereas, there's Windows 365, light blue, dark blue is 1-year reservation AVD, one-to-one, 3-year reservation AVD, one-to-one, and then 200 hours a month. Again, 160 hours would be full-time, 40-hour weeks with no vacation, no holiday, plus another 60 hours for, dedicated employees working after hours. But again, that's a variable cost. If the employees start the VMs more than 200 hours a month, then your cost is going to be higher, right? With Windows 365, it's a set cost. With a reservation, it's a set cost. So anytime you have any of these pay-go scenarios, you have variability, and that has to be part of what we talk about. So hopefully that helps kind of highlight some of the differences between those. And then, of course, beyond one-to-one, the advantage really does go to multi-session, right? So if you can do multi-session, it is way, way cheaper. This is a very conservative estimate of a monthly user cost, but you can see here, if I can do AVD multi-user with scaling, auto scaling, so start VMs that are needed, maybe maximum capacity Monday through Friday business hours, and then lower capacity evenings and lower capacity weekends. I'm jamming multiple users into each session host. At that point, I can really see a lot of efficiency, and again, we're being very conservative here at nearly 50% of the cost, less than 50% of the cost of a one-to-one Windows 365 AVD or 1-year RI or AVD 3-year RI. These numbers here are reused from the previous slide, and this one introduces a one-to-many scenario in AVD. So again, this hopefully helps you all disambiguate a little bit some of the differences, and we do appreciate that some of these differences are kind of hair splitting differences, right? And it can be frustrating for you to say to your end customer, well, tell me more, I want to understand exactly how. But the idea here is we want you to have maximal value, and so value can be found in different configurations from the different services. And so hopefully our intent here is to try to disambiguate. Ken, by the way, Ken also had a lot of contributions to this cost scenario. And here's another one, just giving you another different, more Excel spreadsheet type view. I think, Ken, you worked this one out, comparing, per user at a larger SKU size versus pooled AVD, right? You can see obviously if you can do multi-user, there's huge advantages. This is just reinforcing that same argument that, hey, if it's got to be one-to-one, okay. But if it doesn't have to be one-to-one, really think about multi-user, because you can save a ton of money. One of the other things that we'll call out here is just the client connectivity comparison. Again, this is in the deck for you to reference. There are different client options for the different services, but it's pretty broad support for Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. I will call out that Azure Lab Services, the product team is working on an HTML5 client. There was a private preview for that. I suspect after the calendar year rollover, there will be an HTML5 client, but don't hold me to that. But clearly you can see, as far as a client connectivity model, there is a little bit of a disadvantage because RDP is required for Azure Lab Services Windows machines and SSH for the Linux ones. Whereas over here, you've got all this flexibility around different clients for Windows 365 and AVD. So the other thing, thank you, Rich. Rich, real time added the Azure for Education weekly calls that we have, and I'll go ahead and click that slide just to bring it up. Click that link to bring it up, just to show you the visual of what this looks like. This community that we've got running here, we've been doing it for 4 years. There's a Friday call every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern where we do this is what changed this week in Azure, and this is a deep dive topic that we've got on the schedule. But what I want to focus on is, if you scroll down, the various office hours, and these are weekly or bi-weekly, most of them are weekly, topics that started with Azure Virtual Desktop during COVID, right? So again, the third week of March, we kicked this off. It was the first of these. And then, we have a whole bunch of different birds of a feather type sessions that are every week, and they're AMAs. Show up, ask us anything. Your colleagues are on the call. I know several of the folks that are regulars that are on this call as well. And you'll get answers from us, from customers. You'll get feedback and pointers. So it's really, really cool community. I really like the vibe. Keeps me excited every week. And so you can add that to your calendar and just drop by. So that's, again, at that URL, aka.ms/edu Azure hour. And you can join those office hour calls. And of course, I got it for Steve, brother. I gotta tell everybody, hey, there's also a security one. So Steve and his team host a security office hours as well, bi-weekly. So you can get that on your calendar there as well. So back over to the material, I think we can probably jump into Q&A. I want to point out that there is a ton of additional detail. As we do Q&A, I'll just kind of flip a little bit through the appendix. We're all geeks here, so we have to put more words on slides. We can't help ourselves. Rich and I are trying to. We're like barking at each other. We got to put less. We got to put less because we talk too much and we put too much. But it's technical, and so there's a whole lot of things around roadmap. There's additional expansion on cost consideration. Where's the break-even point? More analysis. Just a whole bunch of stuff back in the appendix, right? So I'm not going to go over all that, but know that's in the deck, and we'll have that up on the on Steve's download link, wherever that is after the call. But okay, so over to Q&A. Anything that we need to address?
At this point, if you want to come off mute and ask questions, please do so. I have not been following along through the chat because it would have made my brain explode, but I am assuming that Ken and Rich and team had the chat figured out.
And the URL I just dropped in the window, Brian. Yeah, you asked for that. And then, you know what? Where to sign up for the Windows 365 1-month trial? Thanks for asking that, John. I'm going to go ahead and show you. So let me bring my browser up. Not that one. Hold on. That's not the right identity. This one. Let's see here if I can find that. Here we go. I'm going to go back here, go to the admin center. So I'll show you what that looks like. I can't actually transact it because I've got kind of an interesting, weird demo environment that's not authorized to buy stuff. But let me back up a little bit in these links, and I'll show you what it looks like. So if you go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, I don't live in this world, so I don't even know what these things are called. But in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, admin.microsoft.com, under billing, you've got a purchase services option, right? If you go over to purchase services, it's got all this stuff we have as part of the Office 365 and 365 suite. But over here, if you look at Windows 365, hey, Eric and team have got their own little button here. And if you look at Windows 365, you're like, okay, cool. Business, no, not that one. Not business with hybrid. No, this one, enterprise, that's the one. So we go over here and we go, okay, enterprise, where's the trial? Well, maybe I'll click details. Okay, details, what does that tell me? So I pop up, we look at details. Now you see all these different SKUs. You're like, oh, okay, cool. But they all have a cost. Where's the trial Manuel talked about? Right here. Hit the drop down. See the first one? Try for free. I think Eric and team are trying to make that a little bit obscure so we don't have everybody clicking this button, because remember, we're eating the cost of a VM for you while you trial this, and it's running all the time. But this is how you do it, man. Try for free, 2x8. Pick that sucker, start your free trial. That's the workflow to get that going. Sorry, Eric, if I stole thunder from you, but it was asked here, so we figured we have a few minutes, we'll cover it here. And then try now. For you, that'll work. For me, I get a red X. And then Ken actually has Windows 365 in his environment. He's the only one of us that was able to get in and get that working when the floodgates opened internally. So he's got one running if you guys want to see that. Is there anything else folks would like to cover? Otherwise, Steve, do we have another like 5 minutes, or when do we cut?
Yeah, we've got another 10 minutes until the next one starts. So
perfect. If nobody else wants to see anything else, then Ken, if you want to show the Windows 365 kind of, both kind of the admin side and maybe even the end user side, that'd be really cool.
Or are they doing that on the next session? I don't know.
Oh, well, yeah. I was just gonna take a minute and show what it looks like from the user point of view. The admin side will leave for the next section, which is 365 entirely.
I'm really gonna mess Eric up. Sorry.
Yeah.
The client side.
Okay. Let me steal the screen share.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. So this is basically, you go to the Windows 365 site. You log in. I'll log in. This is one of my demo users from my mad scientist lab. This is the end user experience. So you log in as your user. Yes, I'm a bad person. I have MFA turned off on this user. You can all scold me later. And when they log in, you get something that looks like this. And you can actually have multiple cloud PCs assigned. I only have one. If I had more than one, they just show up as more tiles here. You notice this is a very simple interface. It gives the name of the machine, last time I was connected, and the specs of the machine. So to connect to it, it's really very much the Azure Virtual Desktop experience. If you've used Azure Virtual Desktop through the HTML5 client, this should look very familiar to you. And it's opening the proxy. I need to log in because at the end of the day, this is, hopefully I type my password correctly. Yep, here we go. So, and this is Firefox, by the way. I'm not doing a Microsoft Edge-y stuff, but so anyway, here you go. And this is really it. It has the 365 machines have this cool purpley background. They are logged in, you know, so it came up and it loaded OneDrive for my user. I didn't need to separately log into that because this is a hybrid joined environment. So again, this is just, I just wanted to give a very, very quick view of what it looks like. It's relatively responsive. One of the things that that was done in an internal demo, which I get a kick out of, is you can actually do a speed test on this machine, and you'll actually notice that you get Azure speed. So if you're on a slow connection at home, you'll see connectivity at Azure data center levels and not how much I can afford in bribes to Comcast. So there's a download, there's the upload.
Yeah, they're pretty performant.
I'm getting better upload than download at the moment. Hey, there's something you don't see very much. So anyway, nice quick little demo, and this clearly, you're not talking about an endpoint machine here. So anyway, there you go. That's really all I wanted to show. I am going to stop right here, and I am going to leave. I will leave the rest of the show for the rest of the group. Thank you.
So one thing I'll do, thank you for that, Ken, is I saw some chatter in the IM as I was yapping away about the scaling plans in Azure Virtual Desktop. So, we were talking about Windows 365 fixed cost set, right? Well, in Azure Virtual Desktop, especially when you're doing multi-user, I mentioned this concept of, hey, let's scale up during the workday, scale down during the weekend. And something that just went public preview within the last couple of days is native scaling, auto scaling for Azure Virtual Desktop. So here's an example. It's pretty cool. If you look at the scaling plan, the options that you have available to you are pretty cool. So if you look at the schedules in my scaling plan, here's a weekday schedule that I've got set up, right? And if you look at the concepts here, it sort of makes sense, right? So what days are we doing this? Monday through Friday. Okay, cool. And then there's a ramp up time. So what time zone are we working in? Okay, for me, it's East US. I'm down here in Miami. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I want the load balancing algorithm to go to breadth first instead of depth first, so I can start getting the best performance and have users scattered across all the session hosts rather than fill up one and then fill up the other. And then the minimum percentage of hosts capacity is going to be 10%, and the capacity threshold for starting more is going to be 60%. So at least 20% of my sessions hosts have to be up. And again, this is pretty low. You might say something more like, I want 90%, right? Again, this is my demo environment. So you might say, hey, by 8 o'clock in the morning, I want 90% of my session hosts up. And I'm going to add more session hosts if I get to some 60% capacity of my sessions. And again, one of the properties you have to set to do auto scaling is maximum number of sessions per session host, right? So if I've got 128 gigs of RAM, I might set that somewhere around the 60 or 50 neighborhood. And then each one of the session hosts I have is 50 users of capacity. And that's what goes into these percentages, the math around how many hosts are there and how many users did you say you'll put per host until they're full. And of course, you can go in here and say the peak. So that was warm up. And then the peak hours are from, let's say, 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. And then these are the rules I want. And then, by the way, when we're done at 5 p.m., then I'm going to go ahead and start ramping down. And ramp down, I can make it forceful. Like, I can choose, hey, don't log users off, wait for them to come off, right? And only shut down virtual machine hosts that have no active or disconnected sessions. Or I can say, hey, man, push these users out the door. It's after 5, and we're going to reduce capacity here. Get out, because I want to reduce cost. So what's cool is you have flexibility around how aggressive you want to be with pushing users off the capacity if they left something hanging there. The other thing we'll obviously call out is you can use GPOs to do things like disconnect and log off users after X number of minutes of idle time, disconnect time, etc. But it's really cool to have this integrated into the portal, and that helps you have that load curve and cost curve mirror each other, right? Because you've got this ability to set behaviors based on load that are affected by day of week and time of day. And so it's pretty cool to see, if I go back to the previous view I had, if I look at the virtual machines, the reason I was looking at the virtual machines is, that didn't work. Let me do this. Look at virtual machines. Actually, let me take one step back. Forgive me for fumbling around here a second. I've got a resource group here that contains the session hosts that are affected by this plan. And if I look at the activity log for, let's say, the last 24 hours for that resource group, which contains those virtual machines that are my session hosts, you'll actually see the Azure Virtual Desktop Service stopping and starting these virtual machines according to the scaling plan. So the cool thing is, the platform service itself is actually stopping and starting the VMs and handling that for me. If activity log will ever choose to come up, probably tempted the demo gods by flipping around too fast. But this actually reflects who's starting and stopping those VMs, and it's actually the Azure Virtual Desktop Service, which is pretty cool. You do create a custom role to allow that to occur, and permission that custom role to stop, start VMs and read some attributes, and session host pull attributes as well. For some reason that doesn't want to come up. I'm not sure why that is. Okay, a little bit of a demo fail. I can show you at least the role assignment that I've got here. You'll see Windows Virtual Desktop has got an auto scale role, which is a custom role that I applied at the subscription level. And these are the rights that the auto scale role needs to be able to do the scaling up and down. So with that, I think we're almost at the end of time, end of our session, not the end of time, the end of our session.
I have a cruise that end of time can't happen. I have a cruise next week, so
no, definitely not. No. The time continues, but definitely, if you found this helpful, definitely jump over to Eric's session that's coming up here at the next hour, as he's going to deep dive into the Windows 365 offering, and Rich and I and Ken and others will be there to throw peanuts from the peanut gallery too.
all right, I'm going to stop the recording.